All right, Daily Ticker time here on a Tuesday, brought to you, as always, by our good friends at Pelican Brewing, now offering their newest signature Pelican West Coast IPA on a shelf near you. Raise your glass, drink on. Pelican Brewing, born at the beach. Let's talk some college football with our good friend, Bill Connelly of ESPN, the man behind the S&P Plus model at ESPN_Bill C. Bill, good morning to you. The fever dream of 2007 is one that we will never forget. And I know you've been kind of following this and the total number of upsets and the chaos and all that. Where is Bill Connelly on 2024 being a season akin to 2007?
Well, I'm getting mad because we fall way behind the upsets, the upset totals of '07 and whatnot. But I'm getting angry because we've missed out on so many wild races because we didn't have a 12-team playoff. Like we've had a normal amount of chaos at this point, but just with the number of different moving pieces involved and the number of title races that matter and the number of all these things, it feels like a chaotic mess, and I love it. And I just wish we had gotten this a long time ago.
Yeah, doesn't the expanded playoff just kind of kill the '07 vibe in a sense of like, oh, yeah, this Miami loss. Yeah, they're still going to make playoffs. So, like, there's really no repercussions to these massive upsets that happen.
Well, I think the first loss has that effect. But, I mean, we've had enough teams with second losses that, things are, just trying to figure out the SEC alone right now is hilarious.
Yeah.
When you look at the number of potential two-loss teams they have, who might actually get left out. Are we going to actually leave Georgia out if they lose to Tennessee and have three losses with the hardest strength of schedule? All that stuff. The SEC alone is an absolute mess, and they kind of deserve it for having an 8-game conference schedule and contributing to that mess. But no, I mean, there's a lot of I enjoy mess, and there's a lot of that right now. Even if like the Miami instance specifically didn't have nearly the repercussions it would have before.
Yeah. Okay, now my co-host, we both love college football out here. We're West Coast college football hippies. We also are well aware of what narratives are in that sport, and it's the SEC and the Big Ten, and everybody else plays by other rules. Yeah. I feel like I know what you're going to say here, but yesterday we got into a little bit of a back and forth on these rankings. If Georgia loses Tennessee, I don't think they make the playoff. And my co-host goes, oh, really? You don't think they're going to make the playoff with 3 losses?
He's new here, Bill. He's new here.
I'm not new here. I just want to believe in fairness for everybody. And yet I feel like you're going to tell me if Georgia loses Tennessee, they can still make the playoff.
Well, they still could, but they are, tonight they're probably going to rank around, 10th or so, which means if they lose again, even to a top team, they're probably going to fall to 12, 13, 14, 15 if it gets bad. That would mean that they're out and could be back in if other things happen. But they're going to be – you lose that third game. And again, they've had the hardest schedule in the country, and it's not going to get any easier playing another top 10 team this week. It's rare that an actual top 5 or 10 level team plays this many other top teams. But no, I think they are – if they lose, they are out – next week, and then it just depends on whatever else happens to get them back in. But we are looking at a really weird situation right now where, who knows how the rankings for sure shape up tonight, but number 8 through about 14, it's probably going to be some combination of 3 two-loss SEC teams and 4 teams that might or might not win their conferences, like BYU, Miami, SMU, Boise State. And good luck trying to figure, there are 4 million scenarios coming off of just that little cluster of the rankings that it makes it really interesting. We could end up with 5 SEC teams. That would not be very much fun considering how much fun we've had to date. We could also end up with 3 SEC teams depending on how things play out. And that's a lot more fun to me.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Bill Connelly is our guest, S&P Plus model, ESPN college football writer at ESPN_Bill C. You kind of answered my next question I was going to ask you there, Bill, because one of the disaster scenarios in the back of my mind is Georgia beats Tennessee this weekend, and then basically you get chalked the rest of the way. And so you have a 2-loss Tennessee. Let's say in this example, Texas wins the SEC, so Texas is guaranteed in. You'd have a 2-loss Tennessee, a 2-loss Georgia, a 2-loss Ole Miss, and a 2-loss Alabama, depending on who goes to the SEC title game in that scenario and loses. If I gave you right now the over-under of 4.5 SEC teams in the playoffs, would you take the over or the under?
I'm still leaning under because I do think all 3, 4, and 5 are all on the table. 3 is not very likely, but it's on the table. I think 4 is still the most likely. Okay. But if you ask me who's getting left out, we're talking about either Tennessee, Georgia, Ole Miss, or Alabama. I don't know. That's a really tough That's a really tough batch to figure out. Now, Tennessee could lose to Vanderbilt in a couple weeks and make this a lot easier, or Georgia could lose to Tennessee and make it easier for a minute.
Yeah.
But I still think I don't know who gets left out, but I think 4 is still most likely.
We also talked about BYU. Indiana BYU came in at 8-9 last week, and many people were like, really? Undefeated, despite what that schedule ranking is. Any other team has that record. They're not that would it be low or high? I guess it'd be high. But is there a scenario looming here? I guess what I'm asking is your takeaway from the first ranking is what? Because I'm worried that BYU may get through the regular season undefeated, could lose in the Big 12 title game to a Colorado. Colorado gets the automatic conference bid, and then BYU somehow is snubbed with their only loss coming in the conference championship game. What was your takeaway from the first ranking?
Well, I think the only thing I know for sure from last week's rankings is the raw record still matters. Like basically, every week I do my little BCS style formula thing that I came across a couple of years ago where I mashed together the poll rankings and the power ratings like SP plus and FPI, and then resume rankings like resume, SP plus, and strength of record. Mash that all together, you typically get a pretty accurate read of how of what the committee's going to come up with. But last week it basically this formula was a little higher on like 2-loss SEC teams, for instance, than the committee was. So I think what the takeaway there is, I think if BYU ends up with 1 loss, they're in. And honestly, that could determine a lot of what we're talking about with SEC bids too. But I do think any 1-loss team from a power conference is in. It's just BYU's really lucky to be undefeated at this point in time, and they have 3 more losable games moving forward. And if you get to like 11-1 BYU versus 10-2 Colorado or something in the title game, and Colorado wins, then BYU might be in trouble at that point. But I think everybody gets 1 mulligan, and BYU somehow still, despite the way the Utah and Oklahoma State games ended, somehow BYU still has its mulligan to play.
Interesting. Yeah, I think every game the way they played this year is a losable game. They've had a lot of nail biters, but that's what makes college football beautiful.
Notre Dame in 2012.
TCU a couple of years ago. Hell, the Huskies were a little bit of this last year as well. His latest piece, 25 players, games, and units that could decide who wins the national title up at ESPN.com. You could also find it on his Twitter account at ESPN_Bill C. And we talked about that earlier, Bill, some of your numbers on Oregon. I'm curious to ask you, because I see a lot of the metrics, and some of it I think is just hard to quantify because of who teams have played. And, Oregon's passing defense, for example, is really good, but they haven't really played anybody outside Ohio State that can throw the football on them. And their rush numbers may be impacted by having to face the best running back in the entire sport this year, and Ashton Genty. When you look right now, what are the numbers telling you about who is the clear-cut best team in the country? And then a follow-up to that, based on the historical precedent maybe, how many teams are the numbers telling us could legitimately win a national championship this year? Like, how deep is that pool?
Well, I think right now, to answer the second question first, the pool's pretty big. I mean, right now, Ohio State's number 1 in SP+, which when you've only lost once to the number 3 team by 1 point on the road, that kind of makes sense to a certain degree. But the most interesting thing to me right now is there are 5 teams within 3 points of that number 1 ranking. Ohio State, Texas, Oregon, Ole Miss, and Alabama are all there. Ole Miss and Alabama aren't even guaranteed playoff spots just yet. Probably, still not guaranteed. And so you start to think about like having an actual bracket at the end of this, and where we don't for sure know who's going to be playing whom, and one of these teams might have to play 3 of those teams, and so on and so forth. That makes things really, really wide open, and that's a lot of fun. So I do think there are 5 teams that stand out, but if it won't take that many breaks for a Georgia or I don't know if I trust Tennessee or Penn State or Notre Dame, but Notre Dame really hasn't given us any reason not to trust them since week 2. Miami has the best offense. Like all these things, like it's going to be an actual tournament at the end of the year with actual randomness and whatnot. And that's, like I said, I wish we had this a long time ago because this is already a nutty sport, and this is going to make things even weirder.
I really appreciated on your piece the Heisman breakdown that you've done. You call it the F1 style, so it's 10 points, first place. You rank them every week, and basically you accumulate the points, and then you rank it out. And I don't know if I disagree with it, but I think a lot of people out here, because they're number 1, they keep rolling. Dylan Gabriel may be the Heisman this year because of the number 1 team, and he's the quarterback, and that's how that sport generally works. He didn't have the greatest game this past weekend against Maryland. I'm almost wondering, Jainty's awesome. I don't know if I actually see voters giving it to a Boise State running back, despite how great he's been. Hunter's played like 200 to 300 more snaps than any other player in college football, which is just insane. Was Cam Ward's best argument to be the Heisman him losing this weekend, that if he is not perfect, they are vulnerable almost every week?
Right, and he still threw for 348 yards, 3 touchdowns, and no picks this week. And it was really interesting though this week. Obviously, the betting odds kind of overreact from week to week on stuff like this. So the fact that Ward's odds dropped quite a bit was kind of dumb, and I think that'll fix itself. But it was really interesting how much Travis Hunter's odds improved this week. Because he's the hardest player in the country to quantify. In terms of he's got really good receiving numbers, but not the best receiving numbers by any means. But then he's also making tackles and picking off random passes and stuff. And so I get it's very hard, and I kind of have to. Every week he's the hardest person to figure out where to put on the list, but I don't have it very high on the list. He's top 4, but he's not number 1. Starting with week 1, Cam Ward and Jeanty have been easily the 2 best players in the country. Gabriel obviously picked up steam, but he didn't start amazingly well. And then, he didn't get any points this last week either. So it's odd. Like usually the horse race, I've been doing this for a few years, and the horse race style that I use and the actual voters tend to end up agreeing at the end of the season, but they're in pretty big disagreement right now, and I'm curious how that plays out from here.
Interesting. Oregon, a bit of a clunky game as we're talking about with Gabriel this weekend at home against Maryland. One of those weird reality checks for me as an Oregon alum of like, all right, we're playing Maryland in November. This doesn't make any sense. Now they're going on the road to Madison, where last time we saw Wisconsin play, they got dog walked by Iowa, but they're also coming off a bye, so that's a unique angle, and it's on the road, and it's a night game. What's the S&P Plus in the model telling us about maybe the most challenging test left on Oregon's regular season schedule?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is, but it's really hard to figure out Wisconsin right now. So for the first 4 weeks of the season, they started 2-2. They underachieved against FP Plus projections by 10 points per game. So they therefore fell out of the top 60. Just they were not good the first month of the season. Then the next 3 weeks, they overachieved by an average of 4 touchdowns per game. Destroyed Purdue, Rutgers, and Northwestern. Charged all the way back to 20th. And in the last 2 games, they've underachieved by 30 points and fallen back to 41st. So I have no idea. Like the good version of Wisconsin plays really, really, really good opportunistic defense, and that version of Wisconsin could, I don't know what the weather's supposed to be like. I haven't gotten there yet in terms of my preview, but that could be a weird November game for Oregon, and they could absolutely give Oregon problems. The problem is we haven't seen that team in like 3 weeks already, and we don't know that it exists. We don't know that the offense is going to show back up. So, Oregon's easily the more reliable of these teams. Well, Wisconsin's, their A game's still pretty good. So they're not out of the woods or anything.
Bama has wins at Death Valley by a substantial margin. They also beat Georgia. What are we going to get pissed off about tonight in these rankings that don't matter yet, but they matter because they're out now? Is Bama poised to jump Indiana and BYU?
I would, I'm not going to say no for sure. I'd be a little bit surprised. I do think that the most likely spot for Alabama is probably 9th. Maybe they hop BYU. I think Indiana's got another step or 2 on BYU just from pure dominance, basically. Last week was the first time all year that they were even slightly disappointing in their performance. So I would assume that Alabama doesn't jump Indiana, especially with the fact that LSU is going to be 21st or 22nd at best. But they're going to jump, and there's at least a chance they catch BYU,
Yeah, great stuff. Bill Connelly at ESPN_Bill C on Twitter. Go give him a follow. College football writer, the man behind the S&P Plus model. His latest piece is 25 players, games, and units that could decide who wins the national championship. A really fun read for all the college football nerds out there. We always appreciate the time, Bill, here in Portland, and hopefully we can do this again soon. Thanks as always.
Absolutely.
There you go. Bill Connelly. Good stuff from him on the whole model and where we're looking and SEC chaos and how this is all going to shake out. I am ready to yell tomorrow. Are you ready to yell tomorrow? I'm ready to yell tomorrow.
I know this is a bit of a hot take in our area. I actually agree with his Heisman thought.
I'm fine with that.
Gabriel's been really good. Gabriel is going to be in New York. He should be in New York. Hunter may get actually more votes than he thinks because of the dual, both sides thing, because it's more intense than even Woodson did in his career at Michigan.
Oh, it's not even close.
But I really do think Cam Ward may have shown us that, like, hey, if he's not absolutely perfect, they'll lose.
Yeah.
And the difference from what they were last year to what they are this year with him, and then Jainty, I mean, I just don't know how you don't put him up there, given where Boise State is and what his season's been.